Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more Socrates. Today we are going to be diving into Plato's Republic, Book 6. We are continuing the desired, we are continuing the journey to try to figure out the perfect city and what justice is. So, let us pick up where we left off. Well then, Glaucon, I said, after conducting a lengthy inquiry, we have, with some difficulty, discovered those who are philosophers and those who are not. Yes, he said, perhaps it should not have been easy to shorten it. Apparently not, I replied. And yet, I still think the discovery would have gone better if only we needed to talk about this topic, and we had no need to discuss a host of outstanding issues if we are going to discern the difference between the just and unjust life. What do we need to discuss after this, he said. The next issue in due sequence, I replied. What else? Since philosophers can apprehend that which is always the same as it is, while those who cannot do so are philosophers, but wander instead amid multiplicity and variety. Which of them should actually be rulers in the city? How may we give an adequate response to this question? Whichever sort proves capable of guarding the laws and proceedings of the city are the ones to appoint as guardians. Quite right. Well, I said, is it obvious whether a blind man or a keen-sighted man who should keep watch over something? Of course it's obvious. Well then, do these people seem any better than blind men? I mean, are these people blind who are in truth deprived of knowledge of what anything is, who have no evident pattern in their soul and are unable to look towards perfect truth, as a painter looks at a model, always referring to that realm and contemplating it with the utmost precision, and who cannot establish regulations concerning beauty, justice, and goodness in the realm, and if they are needed, or act as guardian saviors of what is already in place? No, by Zeus, he said, they are not much different from blind men. So, shall we install these men as guardians, in preference to those we know who know what each thing is, and are not lacking in practical experience compared to the others, or inferior to them in any other aspect of excellence? It would be most strange, he said, to choose anyone else if the philosophers, in fact, lack none of the other qualities. For the particular quality in which they excel is really the most important one of all. Well, should we not explain to how the same people will be able to possess these qualities and the other qualities? Yes, certainly. We said at the beginning of this discussion that it is necessary to understand their nature first. And I believe that if we come to a satisfactory agreement on this, we may also agree that the same people can possess both sets of qualities, and these must be the rulers of the city and not anyone else. How? Well, let us agree something about the philosophic natures. Let us agree that they always love any learning, which would reveal to them something of that being which always is, and does not wander in subjection to generation and decay. We should agree on that. And what is more, they will love all of it, and not just willingly dismiss any part, be it small or large, honorable or dishonorable. They are just like the lovers of honor and the flattering lovers we described earlier. What you are saying is correct, he said. Here is something else you should think about. Consider whether people who are going to conform to this description must have an additional characteristic in their nature. What sort of characteristic? Freedom from falsehood. They will never willingly accept the false. They hate it and love the truth. Quite likely, he said. Oh, it is not merely likely, my friend, but absolutely necessary for someone who is by nature lovingly disposed to anything to cherish all that is kindred and related to the beloved. You are right, he said. Now, could you find anything more closely related to wisdom than truth? No, how could you, he said. And is it possible for the same nature to be both a lover of wisdom and a lover of falsehood. Not at all. So the genuine lover of learning must strive to the utmost for all truths from his youth upwards. Entirely so. However, when desires are strongly inclined in a single direction, we surely understand that they are weakened in the other directions, just like a stream which is diverted from a particular place. Of course. Now, those who are inclined towards the objects of learning and everything like that would, I believe, be concerned with the pleasure of soul just by itself, and would forsake the pleasures of the body. If the person is to be truly a philosopher and not artificially so, this must necessarily be so. Indeed, such a man is sound-minded and in no sense a lover of money. In fact, it is not appropriate for him to be involved in the concerns of money and its objects and its enormous extravagance. Quite so. Yes, and there is something else you must consider if you are going to distinguish the philosophic nature from the unphilosophic. What is it? Be on the lookout for any involvement in slavishness. For presumably, petty-mindedness is utterly inimical to the soul, which intends to strive always for the whole and the entire, of both the divine and the human. Very true, he said. Now, do you think that a mind endowed with magnificence and a vision of all time and all being could regard human life as something important? Impossible, he said. And a man like this will not think that death is something terrible, will he? Not in the least. Then it seems a cowardly and slavish nature would have no involvement in true philosophy. I do not think so. Then again, is there any way that someone who is well behaved, not a lover of money or slavish or boastful or cowardly, could be unjust or difficult to deal with? There is not. Well then, when you are considering whether the soul is philosophic or not, you will inquire whether he was just and gentle from his youth upwards, or unsociable and wild. Yes, indeed. And I think there is one more consideration you should not omit, which is whether he learns easily or with difficulty. Or do you expect that someone would ever really love an activity when its performance caused him pain, and after much difficulty he accomplished little? No, he would not. And what if he could preserve knowledge, preserve nothing of what he had learned? Being full of forgetfulness, could he avoid being empty of knowledge? No, how could he? Now, as his labor accomplishes nothing, do you not imagine he would be driven finally to hate both himself and this sort of activity? That is inevitable. So we should not ever admit a forgetful soul into the ranks of those competent for philosophy, but we must search instead for a retentive soul. Yes, entirely so. What is more, we would say that a person of unharmonious and deformed nature is drawn to mismeasure and to nothing else. Of course. And do you think truth is akin to measure or to mismeasure? To measure. So, we should look for a mind which naturally exhibits measure and good grace, in addition to the other qualities. A mind whose own nature allows it to be led easily to the form of anything that is. We should, of course. Well then, do you think that the qualities we have listed are in any way unnecessary or incompatible with one another? For a soul which attends to apprehend what is adequately and comprehensively, they are absolutely necessary, he replied. Now, is there any way you could criticize a pursuit like this, which no one would be able to engage in properly unless he were naturally retentive, a good learner, magnanimous, gracious, and a friend, and relation of truth, justice, courage, and sound-mindedness? Not even Momus would criticize an activity of that sort. Momus is a foil who is used as a humorous fool. So, the epitome of stupid. Then I said, would you not entrust the city to such people once they have been perfected by education and the passage of years? Then Adeimantus said, Socrates, no one would be able to contradict you on these matters. However, your hearers have a particular kind of excellence, of experience, every time they hear what you are saying now. They think, due to their inexperience in questioning and answering, that with every question they are being led a little astray by the argument. And when the little steps are gathered together at the conclusion of the arguments, the defeat proves to be enormous and quite contrary to the initial assertions. And just like draughts players who are finally boxed in by clever opponents and do not know what move they should make, your hearers are also finally boxed in and do not know what they should say in this quite different game of draughts, played not with counters but with words. However, they have no better knowledge of the truth on account of this process. I am speaking in the context of the present discussion, for someone may now say that they cannot oppose you in arguments based upon each individual question, but that you should look at the facts. Those who venture into philosophy, not taking it up in their youth for educational purposes and then being free from it, but engaging in it for a long period of time, become, for the most part, very odd, or we could even say utterly debased. There are others who seem completely reasonable, except that they are rendered useless to their cities through their encounters with the very subject which you commend. Having listened to all of this, I replied, do you think the people who make these statements are lying? I do not know, he said, but I would be glad to hear your opinion. Then I will tell you. In my opinion, they appear to me, anyway, to be speaking the truth. In that case, how is it appropriate to say that the cities will have no relief from evils until the philosophers rule in them, when we agree that such people are useless to the city? The question you have asked, I replied, needs an answer expressed by the means of an image. And I suppose you are quite unaccustomed to speaking in terms of images. Very well, I said. Are you mocking me? Now that you have landed me with a proposition which is so hard to prove. Anyway, listen to the image, so that you may get a better appreciation of how sparingly I make use of images. Indeed, the plight which the most reasonable ones experience at the hands of their cities is so grievous that there is not a single predicament like it. Rather, it is necessary to draw numerous sources together to develop an image of their condition and conduct a defense on their behalf, like the painters who draw goat stags and hybrid creatures of that sort. So imagine something like this taking place on numerous ships, or on a single ship. The captain, though he exceeds everyone on board in size and strength, is on the other hand somewhat deaf. His eyesight is also poor, and his knowledge of navigation is not much better. Now, the sailors are arguing with one another over the steering of the ship, each believing that he should steer, though he has not ever learned the skill, nor is he able to indicate who his own teacher was, nor when it was that he studied with him. What is more, they assert that the subject is not even teachable, and they do not hesitate to cut into pieces anyone who says it can be taught. They throng about the captain himself, imploring him and doing anything so that he will turn the helm over to them. Sometimes, if they do not prevail and others are preferred, they kill those others or throw them out of the ship. And having entangled the noble captain with drugs or drink or something else, they assume command of the ship, make use of its contents, and sail on, drinking and feasting in the manner you expect from such people. As well as this, they praise anyone who is clever at working out how they can gain power, by either persuading or overpowering the captain. And they refer to such a person as navigator, helmsman, or professor of nautical affairs. And anyone who is not like this, they dismiss as useless. But they did not want to hear about the true helmsman, that he must make a study of the year, the seasons, the sky, the stars, the winds, and everything appropriate to his skill, if he really intends to govern a ship. And they do not believe it is possible to be a skilled and practiced in taking the helm regardless of the wishes of anyone else, and be a skilled helmsman at the same time. Now, since this is what is happening on board the ship, do you not think the true helmsman will indeed be called a stargazer, an idler, and a useless person by the mariners on the ship, which are organized in this way? Very much so, said Adeimantus. Now, I said, I do not think you will require detailed scrutiny of the image to appreciate that it resembles the disposition of the cities towards the true philosophers. I think you understand what I mean. Very much so, he said. And when the first thing is to teach this image to the person who is amazed, because philosophers are not honored in cities, and try to persuade him that it would be much more amazing if they were honored. Yes, I shall teach him. And therefore, what you are saying is true, that the most reasonable of those who engage in philosophy are useless to the multitude. However, tell him that the people who do not make use of the philosophers are responsible for their uselessness, and not the reasonable men. For it is not natural for the helmsman to implore the sailors to be ruled by him, or for the wise to go to the doors of the wealthy. No, whoever invented that ingenious expression was lying. The truth of nature is that whether you are rich or poor, you must go to the doors of the doctors when you are ill, and all who wish to be ruled must go to the doors of those who can rule. The ruler will not implore his subjects to submit to his rule if he is to be of any use at all. But you will not be wide of the mark in comparing the politicians who are ruling now to the sailors we described earlier, and those whom they refer to as useless and as stargazers to the true helmsman. You are perfectly right, he said. Well, under these circumstances and in these situations, it is not easy for philosophy to be esteemed as the paramount activity by people who are acting in opposition to her. But by far the greatest and most intense detraction of philosophy owes its origin to those who claim to be engaging in philosophic activity. Indeed, you said that the critic of philosophy maintains that most of those who embark upon that study are utterly debased, while the most reasonable are useless. And I admitted that you were speaking the truth. Is this so? Yes. Did we not explain the cause of the uselessness to those who are reasonable? Very much so. Do you want us to go on and explain the inevitable debasement of the majority? And if we are able, should we try to demonstrate that philosophy is not responsible for this either? Yes, certainly. Then let us listen and let us speak. Once we have reminded ourselves of where we describe the sort of nature with which someone who is to be noble and good must be endowed. First, if you recall, it was truth that guided him. He had to pursue it comprehensively by every means, or, being a pretender, have no involvement whatsoever with true philosophy. Yes, that is what was said. And is not this one quality, the pursuit of truth, in stark contrast to the opinions currently expressed about him? Very much so, he said. Now, shall we not put up a reasonable defense by saying that someone who actually loves learning would naturally strive towards what is, and would not dwell upon each of the many things which seem to be? Rather, he would go on, without blunting his love or relenting in it, until he had grasped the nature of what each thing is in itself. With that part of the soul best fitted to apprehend this, the part which is kindred to it. Once he had drawn close to what actually is, as consorted with it through that part of the soul, having given birth to reason and truth, he would know and live truly and be nourished. And in this way and in no other would his travail cease. Nothing could be more reasonable, he said. Well then, will he share any love of falsehood? Or on the contrary, will he hate it? He will hate it. So once truth is leading the way, I presume we would never say that a chorus of evils would follow it. How could it? But what will follow is a healthy and just character, accompanied by sound-mindedness. Correct. And in fact, why should it be necessary to arrange the rest of the chorus belonging to the philosophic nature all over again from the beginning? For presumably you do recall that courage, magnanimity, ease of learning, and memory turned out to belong to such a nature, and you objected that everyone would indeed be forced to agree with what we were saying. And yet, if they set the arguments aside and looked at the people we are referring to, they would say that some of them are seen to be useless, while the majority are bad in every way. In considering the cause of this criticism, we have come to a question. Why precisely are the majority bad? And now, on account of this question, we have taken up the nature of the true philosophers once more, and we are compelled to define it. So it is, he said. Then I said we need to look at the corruption of this nature and how it is destroyed in most cases with few exceptions. A few who are, of course, referred to not as debased, but as useless. And after that, we should look in turn at those who imitate this nature and set themselves up as practitioners of it. When souls of this nature encounter an activity of which they are unworthy, and which is greater than themselves, they constantly fall into error, and bring upon philosophy the reputation you describe, in all sorts of ways and in front of everyone. What is the corruption you refer to? I shall try to explain this to you as I am able. There is one point on which I think everyone will agree with us. A nature like this, possessing all of the qualities we described just now, for a perfect philosopher, will be few in number and will develop infrequently in people. Do you agree? Yes, definitely. Now, consider the many significant causes of the destruction of these few. What causes? Well, the most amazing thing of all is to hear that each of the qualities which we praised in that philosophic nature destroys the soul that possesses it and tears it away from philosophy. I am referring here to courage, sound-mindedness, and all the qualities we described. That is very strange to hear, he said. Yes, said I. And in addition to these, all the so-called goods corrupt and tear one away from philosophy. Beauty, wealth, strength of body, strong family relationships within the city, and everything associated with these. Now you understand the kind of thing I'm referring to? I understand, he said, and I would love to hear what you have to say in more detail. Then I said, comprehend it correctly in its entirety, and it will appear quite clear to you, and the previous statements about these goods will not seem strange. What are you telling me to do, he said. In the case of all seeds, or any growth, either in the earth or in animals, we know that whatever does not encounter appropriate nourishment or climate or location feels a lack. And the more vigorous it is, the more it feels the lack of what is appropriate to it. For badness is more opposed to good than that which is not good. Of course. Now it stands to reason, I believe, that the best nature turns out worse than the ordinary nature, under nurture which is alien to it. It does. And, said I, will we not say, Adeimantus, that the same applies to souls? Those with the best natural endowments will become especially bad on encountering bad instruction. Or do you think that enormous injustices and unadulterated baseness originate in an ordinary nature, rather than a high-spirited nature corrupted by its nurture? Will a weak nature ever be responsible for any great good or any great evil? No, he said, the situation is as you describe it. Then I presume the nature we designated as philosophic must develop and attain complete excellence if it obtains the proper obstruction. However, if it is not sown, planted, and nurtured in the proper manner, it attains the very opposite instead, unless one of the gods happens to come to his aid. Or do you believe, as many do, that some young people are corrupted by sophists, and that certain sophists operating in private are a corrupting influence of any significance? Rather, is it not the very people who make these statements who are the greatest sophists, who educate young and old, men and women, to the utmost, and fashion them according to their will? When does this happen, he said? Whenever many people sit down together in large numbers in the assembly, the law court, the theater, the military camp, or some other crowded public forum, and with much commotion they censure some things that are said or enacted and praise others, both in excess. They cry out and applaud, and the rocks and the very place they are in echo with them, and redouble the din of their censure and praise. Now, in such a situation, do you think the young man's heart will fare? What private education will withstand this, and not be swept away by this sort of censure and praise, and be gone, borne away by the flood to wherever it may lead? Won't he declare that what is beautiful or ugly is just what they say it is? Won't he behave as they do and be just like them? Yes, Socrates, he said, he must. And yet, I said, have we still not mentioned the most powerful compulsion? What is that, he said? The compulsion with which these educators and sophists employ through their actions when they fail to persuade with words. Or do you not realize that they punish people who are not persuaded through loss of status, fines, and death? Yes, most definitely. So what other sophist, or what sort of private principles, do you think will prevail in a struggle against such people as these? I do not think there is one. No, there is not. And even the attempt would be utter folly. For there is not, nor has there been, nor indeed will there ever be, a character distinguished in excellence, who has been educated in the system which these people provide. Not among humanity anyway, my friend. Of course, according to the proverb, we should make an exception in the case of the divine. For we need to appreciate that if anything is saved and develops as it should, when cities are in such a predicament as this, it is the providence of God that saves it. If you say this, you will be speaking no evil. Well, that is how it seems to me anyway, he said. Then, said I, is there another proposition you should also accept as well as these? What is it? Each of the private hirelings, whom certain people call sophists and regard as their professional rivals, do not teach anything other than the doctrine of the masses, the opinions that they form when they are gathered together. And the sophists call this wisdom. It is as if a powerful beast was being nurtured, and someone made a careful study of its appetites and desires, how it should be approached and how it should be touched, when it is at its most difficult, or when it is most docile, how the moods arise, and indeed what sounds it usually utters in either circumstance, and what sounds uttered in turn by others make it gentle or wild. Suppose, having learned all this through years of experience of being with the creature, he called it wisdom, set it up as a skill, and turned to teaching it. Without knowing if any of those doctrines or desires was beautiful or ugly, good or bad, just or unjust, he would decide everything according to the opinions of the huge animal. Whatever pleased it he would call good, and whatever upset it he would call bad. And this is the only argument he would have on the matter. Whatever was necessary he would call just and beautiful, without having seen the nature of the necessary and the nature of the good, and the extent to which they really differ, or being able to demonstrate this to anyone else. Now, by Zeus, do you not think a person like this would be a strange educator? I think so, he said. Well, is there any difference between this man and someone who believes that discerning the mood and pleasures of these numerous, variegated gatherings of people is wisdom, whether it concerns painting or music or even politics? For regardless of how someone deals with them, whether he presents poetry or some other product or service to the city, once he turns to the multitude into his masters, beyond the limit of necessity, the so-called necessity of Diomede, compels him to produce whatever they praise. But have you ever heard someone make the case that these productions are in truth good and beautiful, based on an argument that was not utterly laughable? No, I do not think I ever shall, he said. Now that you have understood all this, let me remind you of something. Is there any way that the masses will accept or believe that there is a such thing as beauty itself, rather than many beautiful things, or anything by itself, rather than many particular things? Not in the least. So it is impossible for the multitude to be a philosopher. Impossible. So those who engage in philosophy must be censured by the multitude. They must. And of course, by those private educators who associate with the crowds and who long to please them. Obviously. Now, do you see any salvation for the philosophic nature emerging from all of this, so that it will persist in its activity and reach its objective? Think in terms of what was said earlier. We did agree that ease of learning, memory, courage, and magnanimity belong to this nature. Yes. Will not a person like this, from his very childhood, be the first among them all in everything? Will not a person like this, from his very childhood, be the first among them all in everything? Especially if his body develops like his soul. He must be. And then his associates and fellow citizens will want to make use of him for their own purposes once he comes of age. How could they do otherwise? So they will fall at his feet to petition him and honor him, laying on their flattery as they anticipate his impending power. That is what tends to happen anyway, he said. Now, what do you think a person like this will do under such circumstances? I said, especially if he happens to belong to a great city in which he is wealthy and of a noble birth, and he is tall and good-looking besides. Will he not be filled with unbounded confidence, believing himself competent to manage the affairs of the Greeks and the barbarians? Will he not exalt himself on account of this and be loaded with pretension and empty thinking which is devoid of reason? Yes, very much so, he said. Well, if one were to approach a person in such a predicament gently and tell him the truth, that there is no reason in him, but he does need reason, and that anyone who does not have it must work like a slave to acquire it, do you think it would be easy for him to hear this in the midst of such corrupting influences? Far from it, he said. What if one such person becomes aware of philosophy, turns to her, and is drawn there on account of good rearing and an affinity with reasoned arguments? How do we think the others will respond when they presume that they will lose his influence and companionship? Will they not do anything or say anything? Though through private conspiracies and public confrontations to prevent him from being persuaded and to prevent the persuader from succeeding? Yes, they must. Then is there any way that such a person will enter into philosophy? Certainly not. Do you see now that we were not far wrong when we said that the very qualities of the philosophic nature, once they encounter bad nurture, are in a way responsible for making a man give up the activity? And the same goes for the so-called gods, such as wealth or any acquisition of that sort. Yes, what was said was correct. So, wonderful friend, such is the extent of the corruption and the sort of destruction which afflicts the very best nature with regard to this supreme activity. And we assert that this nature is a rare occurrence in any case. And indeed, from the ranks of these men come the people who inflict the greatest evils on cities and individuals, and the greatest good too, should they happen to be inclined in that direction. But a weak nature never does anything significant, either for a city or for an individual. Very true, he said. And now that these people who are most suited to philosophy have gone away like this, they leave her alone and incomplete, while they themselves live an unseemly and untrue life. Philosophy, on the other hand, is like an orphan without relatives. Unworthy characters arrive on scene, and they subject it to shame and derision, leveling the sort of criticisms you describe, that some of her associates are worthless, while most of them are responsible for countless evils. Well, yes, that is what they say anyway. And what they say is quite reasonable. For other puny specimens of humanity observe that this place is becoming empty, though it is full of fair titles and reputations. Like men who flee from prison to take refuge in temples, those who happen to be cleverest in their own little subject are glad to jump from their professions into philosophy. Nevertheless, philosophy, in spite of her predicament, retains a most worthy reputation in comparison with the other occupations. So, of course, many people whose nature is undeveloped aspire to this, but their souls are stunted and crushed by vulgarities, just as their bodies are deformed by their professions and occupations. This is inevitable, is it not? Very much so. Now, I said, do you think there are any different to behold than a small, bald-headed bronze worker who has acquired some money, has recently been freed from bondage, washed himself at the bathhouse, is wearing a brand new garment, and is decked out like a bridegroom, intending to marry his master's daughter because she is a poor and abandoned? No, there is not much difference, he said. And what sort of offspring are such unions likely to bring forth? Will it not be illegitimate and ordinary? It really must be. Well then, what sorts of ideas and opinions would we say are produced when those who are unworthy of education draw near to philosophy, and consort with her when they do not deserve to? Would it not be best, in truth, to call them sophisms, possessing nothing genuine or worthy of true intelligence? Entirely so. Well, Adiamantus, what is left is some tiny remnant of those who are worthy to consort with philosophy. Perhaps a noble and well-reared character who has suffered exile, who has no access to corrupting influences and remains naturally by her side. Or sometimes a great soul may grow up in a small city and show no respect for the affairs of that city and may see beyond them. Or perhaps some few with natural endowments may come to her from other professions, for which they rightly show an appropriate disregard. The bridle of our friend Theages may also be able to restrain someone. Yes, indeed, all the other factors in Theages' life gave him cause to give up philosophy. However, his inclination to physical illness keeps him out of public affairs and acts as a restraint. But my own sign, the diamond, is not worth mentioning, for I believe it has happened to scarcely anyone else before. Now, those who belong in this small group have tasted the sweetness and blessedness of this possession, and can also see the madness of the multitude quite well, realizing that in a sense, no one does anything reasonable in the conduct of civic affairs, nor is there an ally with whom a man could go to the aid of justice and still survive. Instead, he is like a man who has fallen in with wild animals, has no desire to conspire in wrongdoing, but is not up to the task of resisting all their savagery. A man who will perish before he is of any benefit to the city or his friends, and would be of no use to himself or anyone else. Having understood all this through reflection, he is at peace, and attends to his own affairs, like a man in a storm of wind-driven dust and rain, who crouches beneath a low wall. And seeing that all else is crammed full of lawlessness, he is content somehow if he can live his life here, purified of injustice and unholy deeds, and take his departure with good hope, gracious and kindly as he goes. But surely, he said, if he were to depart having accomplished this, it would be no mean achievement. And we're going to break it up right there because we are coming up on time and they are about to get into more topics. So hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a not too difficult topic. We are talking about the benefits of nature versus nurture. It is obvious that you need a blessing of both. And so all we are doing here is trying to dispense wisdom. We are reading through this and hopefully it helps you to understand it, to hear it. I'm trying to do vocal therapy at the same time. And I'm trying to learn a little bit as we go along with. That is basically all we are doing here. I don't have a whole lot to add to these, right? There's not a whole lot to talk about. It's giving both sides of the argument as we go along. So there's not a whole lot for me to add in. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been PittCast. Peace.